You step outside and the air bites your lungs before you even take a breath. The wind doesn't pause. It never does. Your skin would die in minutes out here. And yet, 20,000 years ago, your ancestors lived their entire lives in exactly this kind of cold. For roughly 100,000 years, ice covered nearly a third of the planet's land. Glaciers a mile thick crushed down on what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. Average temperatures sat 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below what they are today. No heated homes, no synthetic fabric, no supply chain, just bone, fire, hide, and a brain built to outthink the cold. How did they survive this? Not by accident, by design. Start with the body itself. Anthropologists studying skeletal remains from this period have found something striking. Ice Age humans were often stockier and more muscular than people today, with shorter limbs relative to their torsos. This isn't random variation, it follows a biological rule called Bergmann's and Allen's rules, a principle that says bodies adapted to cold climates tend to be more compact. Because a compact shape loses less heat to the surrounding air, less surface area exposed to the wind, more mass to generate warmth. Your ancestors weren't just surviving the cold, their bodies were quietly engineered by it, generation after generation. But biology alone doesn't explain a species that pushed into the Arctic Circle. Technology does. Consider the eyed needle. It sounds almost too simple to matter, a sliver of bone or ivory with a tiny hole punched through one end. But this object, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, may be one of the most important inventions in human history. Archaeologist Olga Soffer, who spent decades studying Ice Age textiles and tools, argued that the eyed needle allowed something draped clothing never could. Tailored, fitted, layered garments, not a hide thrown over the shoulders. A sewn hood, a sealed seam, a garment that traps warm air against the skin instead of letting it leak out the sides. That single tool may be the difference between a species that huddled at the edges of the cold and one that walked straight into it. And they didn't just survive the cold, they built homes inside it. At a site called Mezirich, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered something almost unbelievable: the remains of dwellings built entirely from mammoth bones, skulls stacked to form a foundation, jawbones interlocked like architecture, tusks curved overhead like rafters. An estimated 20,000 pounds of bone went into structures like these, likely covered with hide to block the wind. Before you imagine a flimsy lean-to, picture an engineered shelter, designed and built by people who understood load-bearing structure well enough to keep a roof from collapsing under snow. Why does this matter so much? Because it tells you something modern people often forget. Ice Age humans weren't passively enduring a harsh world. They were actively redesigning their environment to survive it. Fire mattered just as much as shelter. Hearths found at sites across Ice Age Europe show careful, repeated use over generations. The same spot, burned and reburned year after year. Not a campfire lit once and abandoned. A managed resource. Fuel had to be planned for in a landscape with far fewer trees than today, which meant burning bone, often mammoth bone soaked in its own fat, dense enough to burn slow and hot for hours. Imagine the planning that takes. Someone has to know weeks in advance that the bones from this hunt will become next month's heat. That's not instinct. That's forethought, passed down as knowledge from one generation to the next. Food planning worked the same way. You couldn't simply wander out and gather a meal when the ground was frozen solid for half the year. Groups had to think in seasons, not days, drying meat in the brief warmth of summer, storing it through the brutal months ahead, tracking migrating herds across distances that could stretch for hundreds of miles. A single misjudged season could mean starvation for an entire group. So food wasn't just hunted, it was managed like a budget, stretched carefully across a calendar nobody had written down but everybody understood. So let's reconstruct a day. It's deep winter, somewhere in what is now Central Europe, roughly 25,000 years ago. You wake inside a mammoth bone dwelling, hide walls sealed tight against the wind, a fire burning low at the center, smoke curling up through a gap above. Outside, the world is a flat white horizon broken only by the silhouette of distant glaciers. You pull on layered, tailored clothing, an inner layer of soft hide for warmth, an outer layer treated to shed snow. Today, there's a hunt. Mammoth, or maybe reindeer, tracked for hours across frozen ground by people who can read a hoofprint the way you read a sentence. There's no margin for error. A failed hunt in this world doesn't mean an inconvenient grocery trip. It can mean the difference between your group eating this month or not. And yet, here's where it gets harder to imagine. They weren't just surviving. They were creating art and burying their dead with extraordinary care. At the Sungir site in Russia, archaeologists found a burial dating back roughly 34,000 years. Two children laid head to head, covered in thousands of meticulously carved ivory beads, each one estimated to have taken nearly an hour to make by hand. Thousands of hours of labor in the depths of an ice age spent honoring two children who had died. Think about what that tells you. In a world where every calorie was hard-won and every hour mattered for survival, people still chose to spend enormous time and skill on grief, on ritual, on meaning. Survival and meaning were never separate projects. They were the same project. Now here's the twist that surprises most people. The Ice Age wasn't simply a horror story of constant suffering. In many ways, it may have demanded a level of cooperation and ingenuity that shaped what makes us human in the first place. Researcher John Hoffaker, who has studied human adaptation to Arctic environments, has argued that surviving extreme cold required something beyond physical toughness. It required networks. Groups that shared resources, traded materials over long distances, and pooled knowledge across generations did better than groups that didn't. The cold didn't just test bodies. It selected for cooperation, for teaching, for the kind of social trust that lets one person hand a half-finished needle to another and know it will come back finished. In a strange way, the Ice Age may have been one of the great forges of human social intelligence. Here's another thing worth sitting with. We tend to picture this era as static, endless gray misery stretching across millennia. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Tools improved, clothing improved, shelters improved. Art appeared and multiplied. People who lived through the coldest, harshest stretch of the human story kept innovating anyway, kept finding small advantages, kept teaching their children better ways to survive than the ways they themselves had learned. Notice, too, how much of this depended on teaching, not just discovery. A single genius inventing the eye needle means nothing if the knowledge dies with them. What actually mattered was transmission. A skilled adult showing a child exactly how to carve bone thin enough to thread, exactly how to scrape a hide so it stays supple instead of stiffening in the cold, exactly which bones burn longest. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer learning today point out that this kind of careful, patient, multi-year apprenticeship is itself a survival technology, every bit as real as a needle or a fire pit. Knowledge had to be stored somewhere before writing existed, and that somewhere was other people. So what does any of this have to do with you scrolling through this video in a heated room wrapped in synthetic fabric that took a factory minutes to produce? More than you'd think. The instinct that built a sewn hood out of a necessity is the same instinct that drives you to solve a hard problem at work today. The cooperation that lets strangers share a mammoth bone shelter is the same cooperation that lets modern cities function, that lets hospitals run, that lets you trust a stranger to fix your car. The impulse to spend hours decorating ivory beads for a child's grave, even when food was scarce, is the same impulse that makes you keep a photograph, write a eulogy, or mark an anniversary. None of that disappeared. It's still running. Underneath everything. Inherited from people who refuse to let the cold be the end of the story. You step outside and the air bites your lungs before you even take a breath. But this time, you go back inside, into warmth you didn't have to build with your own hands. And somewhere underneath, that comfort is a debt paid by people who sewed the first hood, raised the first mammoth bone roof, and decided in the middle of an ice age that survival and meaning would never be separate things. Ancient humans didn't just survive the Ice Age, they outsmarted it with tools and skills that took thousands of years to master. What else did they figure out that we've forgotten? Like and subscribe to stay updated on the most interesting truths about ancient human life.